Hello, everyone, and welcome to another panel. This is the third panel of today for TBRCon 2025. And today we're going to be talking about what makes advanced technology and sci-fi successful or not. And I did have to read that from the top because I was like, I want to say all the words right. But I'm excited. So much to talk with all of you. I would love to just start. Darran had to step away for just a quick second, but he'll be right back. But I'd love to take a few minutes here at the beginning and let everybody introduce themselves and just talk about whatever they want to talk about for the next few seconds about themselves. So why don't we start with Constance? Why don't you start us off?
Oh, I was expecting anyone but me. Luckily, I know who I am. My name is Constance Fay. I write science fiction romance, so a slightly different bent than the hardcore tech sci-fi. My series is the Uncharted Heart series. Calamity and Fiasco are out now, and Chaos comes out in March.
Awesome. Thank you. How about you, Christopher? Oh, no. Constance, you have something else? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, just one more thing, that I have a background in medical device engineering, so I'm not just here for the kisses and the swoons, I'm also here for the technology.
You can have, technology and kisses and swoons. I think it's all okay. So, all right, Christopher.
My name's Christopher Paolini. I'm probably best known for my fantasy series, The Inheritance Cycle, which started with Aragon and most recently had an entry published, I was going to say end of last year, but I guess it was the end of 2023, and that was Murtag. On the sci-fi side of things, I published a rather large book called To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, which was the first entry in what I'm calling my fractal verse. The second entry in that universe, called Fractal Noise, which is actually a prequel to Sleep, came out also in 2023. 2 books in 1 year. The first time I've ever done that. Never doing that again. Had fun with it, though. And I love sci-fi and fantasy to sort of like the same amount, if not more, on the fantasy side, on the sci-fi side of things than fantasy, mostly because I just love thinking and dreaming about the future that I hope humanity is going to have out among the stars.
Love it. Awesome. Thank you. Well, I'm not sure what happened to, oh my goodness, I'm already going to say her name wrong, and she just told me how to pronounce it. Andrea? Right? No. Andrea. I'm telling you, I'm going to have to write that down or something, because if not, I will keep Andrea. Okay. I have to write out the font or the correct way. Should have done that before. Oh, hey, Darran's back. Perfect time, Darran. We were just introducing ourselves.
Oh, hello. Are we live then?
We are live. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you. We're missing someone too.
Yes, she just disappeared. She must have teleported to the future or something. I don't know.
Okay. Well, hopefully we'll see her there. It's less than an hour. So should I go or?
Yeah, go ahead. Well, I haven't, but they both introduced themselves. So
okay. So I'm Darran Handshaw. I'm a sci-fi author, and I'm part-time as a sci-fi author, but I also work full-time as an R&D engineer. So I get to invent a lot of tech solutions. So this is kind of my forte. So thank you for having me. And I also volunteer as a volunteer firefighter. So I do all those things and write.
That's what you were just doing, putting out a fire? You ran.
No, and I'm a dad, so I was getting my 8-year-old son off the bus. So, and he's a big inspiration for a lot of my books. He's actually come up with the villain in my second book. So he actually came up with the name of the villain and some of the things the villain said. So that was pretty cool.
Oh, I love that. I didn't know that actually.
Yeah, it was surprising. Like some of the things that come out of kids' mouths is incredible, and I was like, wow, that's And I asked him, "Could I use that in my book?" He said, "Yeah, sure." Like, okay,
nice.
That was awesome. Perfect.
And does he get like a little bit every time you sell a book? He gets a few cents, commission
into his college fund, right? Yeah. He's well, you read my second book, right? So he came up with Yoniker, the Eater of Planets.
Oh, nice. That's perfect.
And I think he was 5 at the time. I was like, that's brutal. Like, we're going to use that.
Yeah.
So I wrote, these are my 2 books. So they're big chunky tomes. Basically follow the adventures of an engineer in a broken high-tech city where the people that were in that high-tech city have gone missing and have disappeared for millennia. So after I wrote the book, a lot of people told me it was like a dying Earth type. Jack Vance and Brian Aldiss I was introduced to as similar styles of writing that I didn't even know existed. So I've read those since. So basically people in a world where there's broken tech and it's way over their heads.
That's awesome. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Oh no, I was just about to ask. Okay, well, I'll try to introduce myself, and maybe in a second she'll be back. So my name is Neil Williams. I am a reviewer for FanFiAddict, the blog that hosts this conference every year, and I also do a lot of TikTok content. I'm also a judge this year for the self-published science fiction contest, and it's just science fiction's been a part of my life for a long time, and I'm really excited to talk a little bit about it. Or just listen to y'all talk about it. Really, I'm not going to talk much, but I'm excited for us to talk about this topic about advanced technology. And so, hopefully, she'll be back in a minute. We'll let her introduce herself. Let's see. Hello, are you there?
Yes, I am here, and it seems to be
Welcome.
better. Sorry.
No, you're fine. We were just wrapping up introductions. Would you like to take a second to introduce yourself?
Okay. Well, hi. I'm Andrea Hairston. I'm a professor emerita of theater and Africana studies from Smith College. I ran back and forth from the physics lab to the theater lab when I was young. So I've been a scientist, artist, hoodoo conjurer ever since. And my novels really deal a lot, or half of the novels deal a lot with advanced technology. So I was very excited to be on this panel. Archangels of Fun came out this May, and it's about circus bots. So, and Mindscape is coming out in August, and it's my first novel, and it was like almost 20 years ago. It's a near future novel, and it won the Carl Brandon Award and was shortlisted for the Philip K. Dick Award because of my wonderful scientific and other things that I did. So that's why I wanted to be on the panel.
Love it. Awesome. Thank you so much for being here, everyone. I'm just so it's like I'm just giddy. I'm so excited to talk about this stuff. Hear what y'all have to say. So why don't we just jump into it then? And I would love to hear from all of you talking. This is not number one on my list, so I apologize that I'm asking this. But if you could think of like a technology that you just loved as a kid when you were growing up, like from either a show or a book, just something that just when you were young in the science fiction genre, like what stands out to you to this day is like, I just remember reading that or seeing that. I think that's so cool. So whoever wants to go first, does someone have a preference?
I got one. One of the first sci-fi books I read, it's not very well known. It was called The Truth Machine. And it was an inventor that was trying to figure out a way to create a machine that could tell with 100% accuracy whether you were telling the truth. And all the book deals not just with that, but all the social and cultural ramifications of that. And I thought it was just really well done to see that technology and just show how much that affected the world around them. That was one of the main things that book was about. So that's mine.
Love it.
I don't know this counts.
I watched.
After you.
Okay, I'll go. I watched Star Trek when it first came out, the original 1966. I was 14, so I love the communicator. I love Dune is a harsh mistress, so I love the computer in that. And I saw all of those wonderful robot computer space sagas, and I loved the faster than light travel that many of them did, and the Ansible from Ursula Le Guin.
Oh yeah, that's great. Christopher.
So I kind of have two things, and they're in my head. They're sort of in a similar category, although they are physically quite different. One is the Monolith from 2001, and the other one is the ship from Rendezvous with Rama. And both of those representing, of course, contact with
yes,
alien species. And I don't know. I mean, I could pick. There's so much cool stuff in sci-fi you could pick, but the idea of making contact with an alien species and not really understanding what's going on at first, I really enjoy that. In fact, probably some of my readers with Fractal Noise would accuse me of liking that not understanding part a little too much, but it appeals to me.
I love Rama too. It just how they approach that from a scientific standpoint, right?
Yeah.
Just, uncovering one aspect of it at a time.
Yeah. The thing that struck me the most, that stuck with me over time, was the walls from the Velt, the Bradbury story, the room with the just like, and I know that that's cautionary, but it was still one of those things that as a kid reading it, I was like, that's so cool, and not good, but also neat.
The dark side of the holodeck.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of that just reminded me about the Martian Chronicles, and how you see like technology, like the beginning of that book is like really advanced, and it's almost like the more humanity got involved, the less advanced it got almost, throughout the book anyway. But yeah, so that's great. I love that. That's awesome. Anybody else got anything? Any others that popped in your brain?
The Bobble. I wanted to kind of plug this book. I don't think a lot of people have read it. Werner Vinge. It's called Across Real Time. He invents this bobble that can actually freeze people in a stasis bubble. And people are using it. They're this peace authority, and they use the bobble to freeze. At first, it starts to just be labs that are creating pandemic level viruses that are threatening the world. And it's just very interesting how he shows all the ramifications of what that means, and how the peace authority becomes kind of this authoritarian tyranny, and people can't fight it or else they get bobbled. Very interesting technology.
Yeah, that is interesting. That's kind of like the Will of the Many by James Islington. That I don't know if any of you had a chance to read that yet. It came out last year, but he's got if you're a criminal, you get put in this machine that like sucks your will out of your body, and then it's used by other people that gives them strength and abilities and stuff. Anyway, super interesting. Okay, so my first question that I have written down here is, how do you define successful advanced technology in science fiction? Like, is there really a good, like, when we say, because the title of this, I don't know, is it successful or not? I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on, is it possible for something to be like non-successful in a book, or extremely successful when it comes, like how it comes across to the reader? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think there's probably two ways you could approach that. One would be to say, is it successful from the point of view of what it does for the story? Like, lightsabers are very successful as a story device within Star Wars. Are they successful in terms of hard sci-fi, actual, potential engineering? Maybe not so much. And there's probably a lot of things like that in science fiction. You could also probably point to some things that have a real hard sci-fi basis, or an extrapolation into the future of what could be possible, but maybe they're paired with a story that isn't particularly successful, or they don't serve a good purpose within the story. So to me, a successful piece of sci-fi technology is something that does both. It's both potentially plausible within the rules established by the universe of the story, and it serves an interesting purpose within the story itself.
Yeah, my way of thinking about it was, if we pretend my window is a plot, and you've got a line going that way through the plot, and one axis is coolness and one axis is plausibility, you cannot strain plausibility more than you are cool. So if it's a really cool idea, you're allowed a little bit more leeway, like with lightsabers. And if it's a much less cool idea, or something more rote, or something that the audience is more familiar with, then you have to like restrain tighter to plausibility.
I think consistency is very important.
I want to underline something.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things is something that the audience is familiar with, because unfortunately, a lot of the science that we know is not something that the audience is familiar with. So what we think is plausible and what is plausible are actually two different things. So it's like you can have something that's actually plausible science, but since people don't know it or believe it, or we can have something that people think is plausible. And so I think you also have to work with, what our audience might, and whatever audience you're writing for, might consider to be, plausible. And that makes it a little tricky, because I've read people like slamming Kim Stanley Robinson, and he's like using I'm using this research, and they don't think it's plausible, and they're wrong. But they slam him. So it's not successful because he didn't figure out how to introduce it to them so that they could have a paradigm shift in their head from what they think is plausible.
Interesting. I wonder if is how often that happens in science fiction, where we get a dumbed down version of the science just because they don't think we can handle it, or something like that,
So,
But you
like
kind of have to,
film
or else it
people
ends up
say,
being like an info dump.
there's there's no sound in space, but, we tried it without the sound and it didn't work. So we put the sound back. I literally had this conversation with a production designer. So we put the sound back because, it's emotionally important. And so people don't believe in explosion unless there's sound, because, they don't. Whereas they don't realize you need matter to have sound waves. They don't know that really, because, how many hours do they spend out in space? So many people know that there's no sound in space, and they write the script like that. But then the production designer says, nah, we're going to put that back, right? Because we need it for emotional impact. So that's what I'm talking about, things like that. So it happens a lot. And that's that's just a small thing.
Yeah. I can't remember if it was Battlestar Galactica or Babylon 5, but one of them, the explanation they had for why there was sound in space is, well, when the ship explodes, it releases a bunch of gas. And so when that gas hits you, you're going to have some sound. But I think the classic dumbing down example is the original script for The Matrix had all the people who were plugged into the pods. Their brains were being used for processing power by the machines, and the studio execs felt that was too confusing for people, who weren't familiar with computers back in the 90s. So instead it got changed to, a power source, which makes absolutely no sense.
Right.
Or you have the velociraptor without fluffy little feathers because it's less scary. To me, it's more scary if something fluffy comes at me trying to kill me, but on the screen.
I think that's people who weren't chased by a rooster at 4 years old are saying that feathers aren't scary.
Yeah, they've never met a swan.
A goose.
No. Yep. Oh. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Goose on a mission.
Yeah. Darran, you had something to say a minute ago, I think. Did you?
Yeah, I think consistency. If whatever technology you want to introduce to your story, if it's not consistent throughout and even written into the world building, it's not going to work. Like one example that my wife just reminded me of is an episode of Star Trek that we just saw the other day. In Discovery, they introduced this matter manipulator that could just generate things out of thin air and move matter around and stuff. So yeah, that's soft sci-fi. They don't explain that. But even with soft sci-fi, it has to be used consistently. And they had a whole episode where they used their phasers to blow up some statue on some planet that they were looking at. And then they didn't have their phasers to battle these creatures, and they had to figure out other ways around it. And then at the end, Saru, who's one of the commanders, just generates another phaser with a matter manipulator he's kept carrying around. It's like, well, why couldn't you do that at the beginning? That's not consistent. So there's that, when you don't use that technology, like that's in the character's toolbox, they're not going to forget about it. And as a writer, if you forget about that as a way to get them out of a bad situation, the reader is going to kind of roll their eyes and be like, what the heck? And then the other thing too is there's so much emphasis on like the lightsabers in Star Wars that you brought up. This new technology being used for combat or, other things. And I think this goes with magic and fantasy too, right? It's all used for combat and fighting, and because that's cool. but how is it used in the world to just help people live?
Yep.
Acquisition of materials, how's it going to change the culture, all these things. And that is too often just not thought of. And one good example where I think it was a soft sci-fi thing in hard science was The Ring in the Expanse series, right? And not only did those two authors really capture what the ring would mean for the plot, but they also showed, well, how does it change the culture as the book series goes on, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like all of a sudden people are using it as a trading hub, and they're trying to get different planets, and how are they going to use it in ways that it ends up pissing off the beings that created the ring, right? So all of that consistency makes it really believable, even though we never really get a hard science explanation behind it. It becomes a really nice writing tool.
Yeah. Or even going back to, even warfare, like with the lightsabers. I mean, yes, you can come up with cultural reasons why something isn't exploited, but humans are really good at finding the uses of everything, like you said. And let's say you had lightsabers. Explain to me why you wouldn't generate a lightsaber blade on the tip of a missile.
Yeah.
For example.
Or just use it for mining, right?
Or use it for mining. Yeah, that's the thing. It's like once you
anything.
start asking those questions, and then same thing with magic. It's like, if XYZ is possible, why wouldn't you be using it in every potential situation?
Well, and you've got examples like Tang and Velcro in real life that become household use. Like, you'd probably have just sort of a little mini lightsaber that you use to toast your bread in the morning. It was real small.
Cut your
I
hair.
want that.
Not for me, because that would burn my scalp.
Well, it
Depends
on how hard it is to make the lightsaber.
Mm-hmm.
How hard is it? Yeah, but how hard is it to make the lightsaber? Is it are the things you need really, easy to find, or are they very, very rare, And so I think, like in fantasy or in any good fiction, any element that you create, you have to think of it multidimensionally, whether or not you're going to use that, right? So if you just wanted warriors to have it, because we have plenty of things that only warriors have in our society, right? Well, I wish, but everybody doesn't have like a nuclear weapon.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because partly of the danger of processing it, and partly because of but we have too many of them, right? I think.
The cost,
but
but
everyone doesn't have it.
Right? So the cost, cost to develop this piece of technology. So.
Yeah, all of that. So you have to think of that, and they're probably not when they're doing the lightsaber. They're not going into the sort of cultural and economic aspects of your technology, right?
Well, and one thing that I think,
so to me, it's like you have to look at it as like tools that we have, which ones are readily available, and tools that we have that are not readily available, and why.
Yeah, that's great. Christopher,
I was just going to say one thing that a lot of franchises sort of get wrong, and it's totally understandable. I'm not trying to critique too much here, but it's the scale of things. Like, if you have a human civilization that's even just expanded into the solar system, the number of spaceships that we would have, as an example, the number of, everything from warheads to luxury yachts to this, that, the numbers would be staggering. I've seen a couple of videos going through this and looking at a couple of franchises saying, you're not going to see a couple hundred capital ships showing up in some fight, if that's it, or you're not going to see, this many industrial factories. It's going to be the scale of it is just going to be so much more than we have now. And you think about something like Star Wars, for example, a galaxy spanning civilization, the amount of resources that could be brought to bear on anything is beyond what we can really imagine now.
When you talk about resources too, like the amount of, I think there's a sci-fi YouTube channel called Space Doc that I love. And that was one of the things he mentioned in that channel is, there's no retreats shown. There's no like strategic retreats where people are like, well, this is a really expensive spaceship, so I don't want it to blow up. So I'm probably going to just retreat with this. And the people engaging might give you time to retreat because they don't want to damage their really expensive spaceships. And if you look back to like medieval warfare, there usually wasn't a lot of like battles where everybody on one side was wiped out. It was usually a little clash. somebody lost a night or two on one side, and then they separated and retreated before it went too far south, right? And there's just not a lot of that consistently in showing the value of, hey, maybe I shouldn't get all of my spaceships blown up.
When you look at how much of warfare now is drone based, and you hardly see any of that in space, movies, at least, that, it's just sort of two big ships and there's swarms of nothing in between.
Yeah, requiring like hundreds and if not thousands of people running it, from the inside, which if you're that advanced, like, do you even need that many people to run a ship that size at that point? Like, or will should the technology be advanced enough to kind of mostly take care of itself? That's interesting.
Yeah, I think one of the other challenges with it is not just in like the big spaceship setting, but in the smaller sort of thing, like someone gets a cyborg arm and suddenly they can lift a semi-truck. It's like, you still got a human shoulder that's attached to. Like there's kind of lapses in plausibility there too, that are just, figuring out the basic anatomy of it in a human anatomy form, but also in a story or a world anatomy form.
In Constance, sorry, Christopher.
I was just going to say, all of this is why I absolutely love reading news stories about EVE Online and the horrible betrayals and battles and retreats that happen in that game. And I have absolutely no desire to play it because I would never write another book in my life. But it demonstrates all this human behavior in a game in space.
Love it. That's awesome. If I could drop everything and play those video games, I would be right there with you, Christopher. Constance, I was going to ask you, you mentioned you were talking about like the cybernetic or the arm, right? Like you're talking about an arm where it connects. I'd be curious to know, because your background, right, is in, like, one of your backgrounds is in the medical industry, right? Medical technology?
Yeah, so I've worked in medical devices for about 20 years, and I used to TA in an anatomy lab. And so, yeah, I've been on the medical device engineering side of things for a minute.
I would love to hear if you had like read any stories where you've just really felt like they just missed the mark, or they were really catching the mark on like the medical side of advanced technology. Like, have you seen much of that, or is that just not a subject that we see a lot in science fiction?
I have seen it in smaller ways that you can often sort of hand wave away. That people mess up when in modern day stories, people mess up with, like what presbyopia is or what, vision stuff. So that there's always like little things like that. But I've definitely seen the story where someone gets, like a robot leg and they can suddenly jump to the top of a building or something like that. And to some extent, it goes on that cool plausibility curve. Like if they're doing something really cool with it, fine. But there is, so yeah, I can't think of a perfect example, but I've definitely seen it where the human body's limitations, or someone has tons of extra muscle bulk, but they haven't thought of like the fast twitch muscle reflexes that would make you actually be able to use that bulk.
Right.
So like you've got it all, but instead of just like lumbering around, you'd have to be able to do something with it. And some of that is like, it's too much info dumping, to something that I think Darran was saying earlier, that, there's only so much you can put on a page. But
I think you could show something like that. Like, wouldn't it be so funny if somebody tried to lift something with their cybernetic arm and it ripped off their shoulder? Like,
yeah, right. Yeah, make it dramatic instead of an info dump. Make it part of the story. Make it like the struggle the person has with figuring out how to use those, those big bulky muscles. Then we love the info dump. So it's not an info dump. It's part of the story.
Yeah. I finished a sci-fi book yesterday called The Never Wars. I don't know if any of you have read that yet, but the one of the guys got a cyber, like a bionic eyeball because he lost his eye in combat, military guy, and he kept forgetting to use it. It had like all these capabilities, but he was so used to not having like infrared just built into his head that he just would be like I can't see in the dark, and then be like, just use your eyeball, oh yeah, I forgot.
Well, right. I have a dog in Archangels of Funk who had cataracts. The cataracts were removed and then got an implant that was like much much broader range. And at first the dog can't figure out what's going on, this instead of the info dump, and then learns like, oh my goodness, I can now, like that mouse thinks I can't smell her because she's upwind or downwind, and I can't do it right now because I'm dyslexic, but I can see the heat signature, right? So I know she's there. So I have the dog learn, and be able to use what, and I don't have to explain all of that. It's just like part of like, oh my God, I'm getting used to this now. I like it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a fun info dump rather than, okay.
It reminds me of a story when we first got thermal imaging cameras in the fire department. All of a sudden you could see in the building, right?
Yes.
And everybody just, all the new firefighters, because it's so black in a burning building, you can't see anything, right? So we usually just follow with our hand on the wall until we get to the fire. So when that first came out, people are just following these thermal imaging cameras, and then people started falling downstairs.
Oh, shoot.
Because there's no depth perception. So I was actually in with an actual fire, and one of the firefighters in front of me fell down the stairs and ended up at the bottom of the basement. It was like, well, wait a second, we can't use it this way. You can't forget the way you use your senses normally.
Right. What else do you need? You need?
Well, the cool thing though too is the human brain is surprisingly plastic when it comes to adapting to new input, or at least plastic in the sense that it can repurpose existing structures in the brain to process stuff. One thing I remember reading ages ago, there was a experiment that was done where they made these glasses out of prisms that flipped the image that people were seeing. And after wearing it for a time, the brain flips the image that you're seeing, and you would think that that's impossible, but it happens. So your
brain's already flipping the image.
Well, because we think we see what's out there, and we actually see something. The image comes, it's upside down, and we know how to read that. That's all. And then if you jumble it up, we learn how to read it again with our other senses. Like falling down the stairs or walking into something. You start to have other input. So
I think we're just going to become more and more integrated with technology. I mean, I think, smartphones we're basically cyborgs with our smartphones now anyway. It's just not
your glasses.
Well, they're making contact lenses with it too that are
That's
lenses,
that guy
tear film and blinking and stuff.
You guys know what Neuralink's working on, right? The end goal in Neuralink is to have like a brain hat that you could ascend into and be, mostly processor. That Werner Vinge book I was talking about, Across Real Time, has that. He wrote about that in the 70s, which just blows my mind. And actually characters, when they have to disconnect from it and they feel like they're a toddler again.
Werner Vinge is actually just great in general about extrapolating technology or postulating something and then building out from it. He did one book, and I forget the name of it. It was like Beyond the Rainbow or something like that. I know Rainbow's in the title.
Yeah, and I haven't read that one yet.
I think the concept of it, if I remember correctly, was that a treatment is invented that allows dementia to be rolled back. And so there's someone in a nursing home who gets this treatment and comes back to full awareness and rejoins the world. And of course, everything's completely changed from when they were younger. And I mean, it was such an interesting premise for sort of a very small sci-fi story. Vinge has always been a big fan of his and his ability to extrapolate.
That's great. I'm curious on this line of thought. Can you think of very many like technologies that you read about when you were younger that exist today, and are they greater than what they were envisioned to be? Are they less are they seem to be as mind-blowing now as they were back then? Like, I'm curious if anybody's stumbled across that. I didn't ask that in the questions. I'm sorry, but
the communicator from Star Trek.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that one is ubiquitous.
Oh, no.
My screen fell over. Getting too excited because I have windows behind me that blot. Yes. So yeah, the communicator, and all of the, like talking to the computer, like all, most of that, not data later. We haven't gotten there yet, but, just that, and I, people said, oh, I saw the communicator and I wanted to make one. And, so it inspired engineering.
And the iPad.
People.
The iPad's better than the iPad is better than the data pads that were on Next Generation. I mean, it's
right. But So Spock going around with all of his little devices. Now we have them. So, and those were, and some of the medical stuff that Bones had, we have not all of it, but some of it. So, and that was 1966. And the robot in The Day the Earth Stood Still actually seems more like the kinds of robots we're able to make, that are assistants and whatever. Huh?
Gort.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So, and these are like, because you asked childhood, I'm old. So, I saw The Day the Earth Stood Still and, love that robot. So unfortunately, ChatGPT doesn't provide as coherent and correct answers. What? As the Enterprise's computer. Oh, yes. Okay.
But imagine if the Enterprise's computer was providing ChatGPT answers. There's like a whole season in that.
Yes.
If Q took over the computer.
The computer did not hallucinate. So.
But you know what? I don't think they can get rid of the hallucinations. I really don't.
You think they can?
No, I don't.
They'll get to it at some point.
No, I'm like, I'm researching AI. It seems to be a problem that is inherent in how, the deep learning works. And the deep learning we don't actually have access to. So it's hard to get there and rearrange it. So it seems to be a function of deep learning. And deep learning is how they're able to be magical. So, so it seems to be intrinsic, not extrinsic. We're not like, oh, we can just pull this off and everything.
Part of it is there's no check and balance really with it.
That's what I'm saying. So
it has to give you an answer no matter what. So the deeper you get into any subject, it will eventually give you a wrong answer. And
not only that,
not even deep. Unfortunately, not even deep.
Human beings.
Sometimes not deep. Yeah.
Human beings.
Yeah.
We hallucinate.
Yeah.
Yes.
And we have no way to counteract that. And even if you think you are 100% rational, I guarantee you are not. And we are the only example that we know of, I'll say sapient, although that's not sentient life, although there's other examples, but at the level we're at. And we have no idea how to replicate that in a non-brain substrate at the moment. So I really don't see this. I mean, this whole thing with AI, it's pseudo intelligence. It's glorified autocorrect. It works great for simulating.
It's applied statistics.
Yeah, it's great for generating voices and images and even video now. But I don't see it rising past that at the moment. And I say this as someone, I just had to revert my version of MS Word to one from September last year because Microsoft crammed in something they're calling Copilot, which is their
get the fuck out of here.
And the worst thing is it was putting this little icon next to the empty line where the cursor is in any document, this little icon that would not go away, and there's no way to remove it. So I had to revert to an earlier version to get rid of it.
I was fighting with that last night, literally. I was looking on everything, trying to figure out how to get rid of it. And none of the advice actually works.
Yeah,
I was so happy to be using OpenOffice when I heard that because I always hated the suggestions and the underlines and stuff. It blows me out of writing the story.
Oh, well, you can turn those off in regular MS Word.
You can turn those off. I've turned mine off.
But it does auto format things too that are weird. Like all of a sudden it will just start formatting the indent differently. I don't know if you've noticed
your
that.
Text for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, I don't know. I've always had that issue with Word. But that's not good that AI is kind of looking at everything.
And also AI is only as good as the data set it trained on, right? And the data set it trained on is not infinite. So we already know that. The data set it trained on is biased by nature. And I'm using bias simply to speak of, there's a limit to it. Yeah. So since it's biased and it exacerbates those biases, right? So often amplifies them. So whatever those are, you will now put a comma everywhere. Like, I don't want that comma, right? Yeah. But now commas rule, and English is really idiosyncratic with commas, as a language.
And of course, the data that these systems are being trained on, more and more of the content on the internet is now AI generated in general. So now they're training on
itself.
Yeah, which doesn't work so well.
No. And this is not anti-science. This is like anti the like, I don't know, people who are trying to push this particular technology on us. Like Microsoft saying, you will now use this. I don't want that.
Yeah.
Right.
You're a Luddite. No. Well, yes, the Luddites they didn't want to get rid of machines. They wanted to be in charge of them and not have the bosses in charge of how they worked in the world. So
that's good. So I'm going to slightly change direction on conversation just a little bit. I want to talk a little bit more about, or just hear your thoughts on, from a writing craft perspective, about developing some of these advanced technologies. I'm really interested in hearing when all of you are going into writing your stories, what has been your process of coming up with more advanced technology in your stories that take place in the future? Like, do you just go and say, it'd be cool if, we had a solution for this and you write about it? Or do you go into the story knowing what you're going to write? Or like, does it just kind of come up as you go? What are y'all's thoughts?
So lately I've been writing a lot of mystery short stories set in the same setting. And I've been looking for technological mysteries. So I've been looking for something that could be used to take advantage of someone or commit a crime or something like that. And then trying to figure out, well, how to make the crime, a bit mysterious from the investigator's perspective and where it's not clear what happened. So I've been kind of working backwards in that regard and coming up with some interesting ideas.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I write soft sci-fi more than hard sci-fi. So for me, a lot of the sci-fi elements are setting more than they are plot, let's say. And the things that are impactful to the plot are the things that are more interpersonal, like the biomedical side of things. Maybe if the character is an engineer, how do you fix the 3D printer on your ship that is printing all your food because it's broken? So I focus more on the smaller scale level of the sci-fi tech, and the larger scale stuff as to how does the ship work? How do the blasters work? I don't go in depth into how the blasters work, but as we were talking earlier, it's about what are the impacts of that. So if it's light-based weaponry, then everyone has armor for light-based weaponry, which means that the armor is very insubstantial if you have non-light-based weaponry that is suddenly going after that reflective armor that does very little. So it's more that kind of thing than going into the deeper sci-fi ponderings.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Well, when I was writing Archangels of Funk, I was at a group. Well, I was at Princeton hosted this event called Black to the Future, and I'm an Afrofuturist. So there were a whole bunch of us there, and we were all talking about Black to the Future and what are the issues with the biases in AI. And I came up, that I wanted a 7th generation algorithm, that I wanted to have algorithms that trained on different things, had different, values at the, in the black box. And what would that do to, the rest of the, what else it did. So that's where I created my circus bots, because they have the 7th generation algorithm. And so I had done work with a roboticist and an ethicist. And then I also talked with people from MIT, and I said, what about, programming for emotions? Because we actually think we're rational. And in fact, we're not rational. That's like one of our illusions. Every thought we have has an emotional component, and all emotions are thoughts. So we have 2 words for those things, thoughts and emotions, but actually it's the neural networks doing their thing. And then we label them thoughts and emotions. So, and we're trying to create this rational being, because we've elevated that to superior to our emotions. But in fact, you can't make a choice without emotions. That's how you make choices. Like, do I want to do this or do I want to do that? So the zeros and ones are affected by this valence. Right. And how do you program for that? And actually, when I said that to somebody, he said, I'm working on that. So I went, yay, that's my sci-fi idea, and you're working on it, great. So, he hasn't solved it yet, or, which is fine. But I thought, okay, that's a direction people are trying to research, because, the notion that we're rational is one of those false ideas that we have. And the notion that thoughts are pure or not body-based, or, and that the gut is not influencing your thoughts is crap, right? So your gut bacteria influence your thoughts, as well as your position in the world, all that stuff. So how do you program that in? And only, in a minor way. I'm not trying to make a complete android being. So those are my bots. They have some of that. They have the 7th generation algorithm, and they have someone trying to code in emotional components or valences for each of their, if I make this choice, what valence will it have? And if I make that choice, what valence will it have? And so it's been fun, thinking about the implications of what kind of robot being would result from that. So that's
it's so interesting that all the AIs that we see in sci-fi, they're always Data is looking to, I need to get in touch with human emotions, and I don't understand them, and all this stuff. But when you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, it's your emotions are like a more primitive portion of your brain, right? And your neocortex evolved on top of that, and is
on top of it.
Yeah, and is affected by that. And like you said, it creates a lot of bias. It creates a lot of illusion to your neocortex when you bake those emotions into it. So it's would an AI that gains sentience really be looking to distort their logical thought patterns with weird chemical-based emotional responses?
Well, I
I
wouldn't say distort, because, for instance, empathy, that's an emotion. So to me, empathy is essential for the survival of life, right? I'm all about survival of the friendliest, not the selfish gene, right? Yeah. So empathy means, I can feel the state you're in. So if we hear a crying animal, any kind, we all react, right? That's primal, and
but you could come to a logical decision on that too, and say, it's better for me if I save that person, right? It's better for all humanity.
There are plenty of people who disagree.
Does anybody? Can we phone a Vulcan? Does anybody know any Vulcans?
Well, I'd also add to that emotion provides motivation. I mean, there are evolutionary benefits to emotions. You burn your hand on a hot stove. That fear you feel, that pain you feel, is necessary to function in the world. People who do not feel physical pain, of which there are some, tend to go through life accumulating horrendous injuries and tend to have actually a shorter lifespan as a result. I think that if we had a truly self-aware artificial intelligence, that it would by definition, feeling things, responding things, probably would be neurotic as hell, and might just, instead of being bent on world domination, just might look at everything and say, screw this, I'm just going to go watch videos on YouTube and scroll through memes.
Murderbot.
Yes, Murderbot.
Murderbot. Yes.
Murderbot.
And I love that, what you said earlier about, the link between emotions and the body, because one of the coolest things that I knew this, but I saw it said, and it really struck me, which is that our thoughts, though, whether you think in terms of imagery and emotion, or whether you think in terms of words, however you go about that in your head, the things we think actually have a chemical effect on our body, right down to the individual cell layer. If I think I'm going to clench my fist, that thought has now caused individual cells in my hands to experience a chemical reaction. And the things we think dramatically influence our body, and we often try to separate that or think that's not the case, but it's not.
It's all tied together.
To answer the larger question, though, about how I went around, developing sci-fi technology, there's so many different ways to do it, and I think it's based off the needs of the story and what you're trying to accomplish. In my case, when I was developing the Fractalverse, I was trying to extrapolate what seemed to me a realistic future from where we are now, because it is in our future. My stories are in our future. So I was looking at what I thought seemed reasonable for, biomedicine, computing, all sorts of different types of engineering and space-based solutions. The biggest one for me that I sort of took departure from reality was deciding I was going to have faster than light travel just so that I could have the cool factor of going around to different star systems. And I've talked about this a lot before, so I won't go in the details, but the big thing with that was wanting to create a version of faster than light travel that didn't contradict physics as we know it, that hadn't been used by any other franchise, and most importantly, didn't allow for time travel. And I consulted with a number of physicists and ultimately with a nuclear engineer, rocket engineer who works with NASA. And he and a couple other guys have a theory that gave me the basis for what I needed. And that is not real, but I tried to be as realistic as possible with it, both with the math.
But it hasn't been proven as it hasn't
been proven false.
And I think that's key too. You know, if you pick something that scientists have disproven, that
and a lot of this
up for disaster.
A lot of this, what I did was all background stuff. You know, it's not like I'm info dumping it. It's just there in the world. It changes how people behave and how they interact, but I'm not info dumping it. And I loved doing it, and I love doing more of it. And it's, you know, fantasy is very similar in a lot of ways. In fantasy, you break the laws of physics, and when people say, how did that happen? You wave your hands and say, a wizard did it. And in science fiction, when you break the laws of physics and people say, well, how did you do that? You say, well, I reversed the polarity of the flux capacitor, and don't think about
inverted tachyon beam.
That's right.
Someone mentioned earlier in the chat, I could go back and find it probably, but they said, I think they asked, or essentially said like super advanced technology basically equals magic, I think they said, or something like that, or it's
Arthur C. Clarke said that, right?
Yeah. Yep. And there's a corollary to that, which is sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from the laws of nature.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's the thing, and it ties in with magic too, is that like if you just have a super powerful wizard that's doing super powerful wizard things, it's a really boring story, right?
Boring.
Because there have to be consequences, there have to be offshoots, there have to be all the other things that it does that
limits
is good. Yeah, limits. And so you can have that crazy advanced technology, but it follows the rules of magic then, where you have to have those limits and consequences and downsides. So it's not just pure magic.
That's one of the things that I love exploring in my stories is that I've got, you know, people that were dumped in this broken, very high-tech city, and they've got more of a medieval understanding of technology. So for them, everything is indistinguishable from magic. So you actually have, well, how does that affect your culture? Some people are going to worship it. Some people are going to try to use it for power. But it's really fun to me to come up with the technology and have some sort of thing, and then have the characters, even the main character engineer, speculate as to the purpose of it and get it totally wrong, and just really not know what it was for, but come up with some working theory, and maybe it helps him out, but maybe it doesn't, you know.
The Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe's another example of that, where it's set in the far future, but it reads like fantasy, and it takes a while for the reader to.
It takes several books, right? Yes. Because the first you can read a book of that and not know what. Yeah. It's
another one is Non-Stop by Brian Aldiss in just one book. It's kind of crazy how he goes from this nonsensical kind of fantasy story to something much more, which I won't spoil for you, but that's a quick, easy read for people that like that sort of thing.
But so much of how this comes across really depends on the skill with which you write it. I mean, Constance, like I was, thinking of your point, you know, Tolkien with Gandalf does not explain the mechanics of the magic to the reader, at least not in, you know, the main trilogy. But it works. But that's maybe the hardest way to do it. Like as a fantasy writer, to write magic where you don't explain the system to the readers, and it hopefully doesn't feel like a Deus Ex, and it really is kind of a wizard doing things, and it works. It really is like the highest level of difficulty in terms of storytelling.
Well, I think he filled the readers with such wonder as to this crazy world that he created that a lot of people weren't questioning that. Like I've seen people say, well, why didn't the eagles just fly the hobbits right into the volcano to drop the rings in? And it's like, yeah, that's true. But people are, I think, so filled with wonder at Tolkien that nobody was, the vast majority of people weren't asking those questions, right?
Well, they could be filled with wonder because he used him sparingly. Gandalf wasn't always flying. Gandalf was, shuffled off screen or off page for a while to, go do other things and let people solve their problems on their own.
And Gandalf didn't know everything. Gandalf also didn't know everything.
Well,
you did get the sense that his powers were limited in some way. We just didn't know how.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you do know that he would be corrupted by the ring, right? So
that's true.
Yeah, right. He did not want to. No, I won't touch it. Right.
Yeah. Well, and I was just going to mention the eagles. I don't know how long it's been since I've read Lord of the Rings, but there's a whole chapter about how they went up to the eagles' nests, and the eagles, were, we don't have to do this. Like there's, the eagles were independent beings.
They have their own stuff.
Yeah, it's like they're not just gonna at any whim, just answer the call to take the ring. They had their own life to live. But anyway, okay, that's good. I'm curious is when my thought was as a non-writer. I'm really wondering, when you're writing, though, does the technology just sort of come up in the world building process, or do you have to sit down and write out a plan for, in my world, it's going to have this type of technology, this is the cap level of our technology, or how do you know what technologies should be together, and are some more advanced than others for any particular, what's your process with that?
I make a very firm plan because I like to know what is or isn't possible in my world before I start writing in it. Some things may develop as I write, but the general big stuff I want to know. And this would be the same with fantasy. I would want to know what magic is possible in my fantasy world before I start writing it, because it could determine everything from travel times to warfare to diplomacy to manufacturing. So yeah, I like to know what's possible before I'm writing.
I've got a little bit of an easier out with that, because my technology in my books has so far evolved around when do characters stumble across it and figure out how to use it in some way. So I could kind of get away with more, less planning in that department. Although I did just write a short story flashing back thousands of years, and I had to put a lot more thought into that. Before the city fell, and why, and what technology did they have?
Well, in your context, though, that story's more advanced than your current story in a way.
Yeah, because going back in time, they have, I guess, functional utility over all of the technologies that they're using, and I really need to understand, well, what do they have, and how is that going to impact that story? And even though it was a short story, it has to be very consistent.
I go back and forth. I do improvs, figure it, and discover something. Then once I discover it, I have to integrate it, right? So once I know, oh, this is a thing, and then how would that thing change everything else, right? So then I map that out, and then I go back into the story, and I'm writing that, discover something else. Pause, go back. Do you want this thing? Is that against that thing? So it's for me, both things, sort of not quite simultaneous, but I like the improv. I like not knowing and discovering, and I like stage managing what I've discovered.
Sometimes you have to engineer a solution too, for instance, the beings, there are beings manipulating things behind the scene in my universe, and because of that, I need them to not have discovered interstellar travel or anything like that, right? So I had to come up with reasons why they wouldn't have figured that out, because when I wrote those short stories and looked back at all the tech that they would have, I was like, well, they can't have rocketry. They can't be, maybe they could get satellites into orbit, but they really can't, be doing, interstellar travel, or else the whole story would be broken. So I had to figure out ways to, have those beings that are orchestrating things behind the scene prevent that from happening. So they sabotaged it. So sometimes it's interesting. You have to engineer reasons to support the story, I think, also.
Yeah. Reverse engineer, right? Yeah.
Right. Like you, and I look, by the way, as a product engineer and designer, stories are very similar too. Like the more we write in a universe, the more we call them in engineering boundary conditions. You can't break the boundary conditions, or else part of the system will break. And that goes for the reader, you know, the same way it would cause a product to fail in real life. So, you know, it's a very similar approach. We are actually crafting and engineering a story.
Right. It's a design process.
Right.
Yeah. I would say for me, it's similar to that if it impacts the character or the plot, I plan it out first. But if it's something that leaves space for something to come up in the course of the story. So for instance, in my world, a lot of the wealthy people have ocular mods that allow them to do things that other people can't. And the main character grew up in a wealthy household and left when she was about 20. But she doesn't have those mods for a very good reason, because our vision doesn't settle until we're about 21. And so she couldn't have had that surgery in time. And then how does that play out with everything else? So, you know, that I plan some of those things ahead, and some just sort of come up in the course of the story as, hey, that'd be fun.
That's awesome. So Christopher, it sounds like you might be the plotter. Is that what it's called in writing, or what does that look like for you? Are you just have a document with like technologies, or like what does that look like in your process?
I mean, it's all creative, but it usually starts with a general idea of what I want things to look like, and then justifying it. Also doing a lot of reading and research. There's a great website called atomicrockets.com, and it was used as a resource by the two guys that did The Expanse. It was also used by the writers of Mass Effect, and I've used it. And it was specifically created as a resource for people who want to write science fiction, to give them a lot of hard sci-fi info. So if you want to diverge from that, great, but at least there's some good info there. So I've done a ton of reading there. I've done a ton of research on my own. And then, you know, I just try to stay up with developments of technology and science. And then that always sparks ideas. But generally what it looks like is me, fountain pen, a notebook, and a lot of time. Yeah. And then I just write and write and write, saying, well, what's the implication of this? How would this affect this? How would this affect that? What would people think of and feel about it? And that's all it is. A lot of questions and a lot of searching for answers.
Mm-hmm.
So I know that several of you are in more like fields of like engineering and medicine, you know, and all sorts of different things. How often do you though send do you ever get like people in fields of like scientists? And I know that Christopher mentioned this earlier, that he called and talked to people, but does any of the rest of you ever just try and reach out to people who are in those fields to see if your technology makes sense? Like, do you do that, or do you not worry about it?
I live at a college. I prey on them. And I went to, so I can just go to, the physicists or the chemistry or the neuroscientists or the biologists. And I've done that my whole life. And I actually went to this college. It's a liberal arts institution. So it's wonderful. So there's a whole tradition of doing that. And so they gave me, lots of things to read. And we have an institute at Smith called the Kahn Institute, and it's interdisciplinary. And so the whole idea is to study a subject from multiple views. So I did one a long time ago that looked at Galileo and space and all of that from Italian, physics, astronomy, theater, music, and literature, right? And so I think I have that as a model, and everybody comes in and does a presentation from their discipline. So I feel like I've been blessed, and I've had that, I've retired from that, but I'm going to do a Kahn Institute this spring at Smith on AI and human values, and it's philosophers, mathematicians, computer scientists, theater, science fiction writers, me, and, visual artists, coders, and we're all going to sit around and, look at it from all the multiple perspectives. And then each of us will do a project, which none of us know what that will be. So, I'm always like, hey, come talk to me. And they want to know things that I know. So it's not just I'm, doing a brain drain, but, the things that they have yet to think about because they're, doing what they're doing. So it's like an exchange. It's really excellent.
It's awesome.
Yeah, I talk to computer science friends a lot because that is not my brand of engineering, and it is one that my brain like violently rebukes. And so I appreciate talking to them. I've actually talked to my friends that are psychologists a shocking amount for it, because that's another thing that we don't necessarily place is like, what is mental health in space? You know, what, how does that roll forward into the future?
Yeah.
For myself, I just read a lot, and as an R&D engineer, you know, I kind of dabble. I started as a mechanical engineer, but you know, I got to look into software, optics, electrical. So what we like to say is I know enough to be dangerous with just about anything. So I do a lot of research myself online, and look at a lot of scientific explanations and stuff. And I try to use those to support the concepts I'm coming up with without breaking anything. And also, like we've talked about earlier, it's got to be rooted in some theory that hasn't been disproven, right? So because it is science fiction, it's not science fact yet with the stuff that we're coming up with. So yeah, and especially writing tech murder mysteries, I'm probably on the FBI's watch list at this point with the stuff that I'm researching. So
I'm sure we all are.
yeah.
Yeah, like following my online trail.
That's why we have to do forum panels like this, so that there's proof that we're putting it to good use.
Yes.
Oh, that's amazing. Christopher, I'm curious, the people that you mentioned earlier that you talked with, that you called and talked with on the phone, scientists and things, were those people that you just already had a natural connection to, or did you like send an email somewhere and say, hey, are you willing to talk to me? Like, how did you get in touch with them?
No, I have no shame about reaching out to people. I've grown up in the public eye, so like.
So you show up at their house.
Almost. I grew up with the internet too. So
with his sword.
I was just doing research, and I ended up digging up like Excel's, I don't know, slideshow PDF. It was Excel slideshows of some presentation that was given to NASA like 20 years ago, and it was buried on some website. And I found this guy's name on one of these slides with, you know, information that was relevant to what I was researching. So I found his email and just emailed him out of the blue and said, you don't know me from a hole in the wall, but I've written these books and I'm researching this topic, and you want to talk to me? And he literally spent probably days on the phone with me. I mean, I only graduated from high school, so I've had to do a lot of education on my own to get myself to a level of understanding where I felt like I could write about these things with some degree of confidence. And that was really helpful. I mean, I reached out to a whole bunch of people. Some of them didn't get back to me. I had one interesting experience. I was talking with a physics undergrad, and I was saying, well, I was trying to postulate a hypothetical. And the hypothetical was, you know, okay, I know physics says X, Y, Z, but what if Y was different? And they literally could not entertain the possibility. Like, they had zero imagination. They could not conceive of that value or, you know, law of nature being different, and wouldn't even discuss it. I have never encountered that before.
I've seen that a lot in the industry, actually, because a lot of people are very fixated on, well, this is the way it's been, and we've proven this, so it has to continue forward. And like, as a concept engineer, I'm constantly asking questions, you know, even in the field. Well, what if we do this differently? What if we change this? And I get a lot of no's, but some of those questions end up in like a new product breakthrough. And that is, I think, important to do, not just for ourselves, but also not just for people actually making products and real technology, but also for us with our imagination, so that we can inspire people to really think differently. Right?
Well, and what gets me is, like, with physics, we know, if you study the history of science, and if you look at the unanswered questions in physics, we know there are some very basic fundamental things that we have got wrong at the moment, because, you know, I mean, we have good working theories on a whole lot of things, and those probably aren't going to fundamentally go away, but we also don't understand a whole lot of basic stuff. So our assumptions of what is right are going to have to change. And the only way you're going to get that is if you can think outside of what's already established. And the same goes true for writing and for world building. You have to be willing and able to consider every possibility, even if you discard 99% of them. And, and then if you go in for revision, something's not working, you have to re-examine your basic assumptions and have to be willing to change the pathways you've already laid down in your brain, which is hard. It's so hard. It's almost like re-examining a political belief or a religious belief.
We call that in my line of work, we created a term called design attachment disorder.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing.
That's mine. You can't change it. And once you get into that mode, you've got something that's going to be subpar.
So that's that sunk cost fallacy.
It's people that are
emotionally. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's people that are certain that they are being logical, but they are operating from a place of emotion that, maybe their career has been built on this thing, or they learned this thing and they did really well at learning it. And so they're like, that's it. I'm the best. I know it. And it can't be different.
And you invested a lot of time in some approach too. So to discard that approach is quite painful, right?
Really hard, really hard. And scientists are people, so they share that. Even though they have a whole process of trying to externalize the fact that you might have biases and work on it, it's very hard, even with proof. So most, I took a history of science class when, and then you see all the shifts in like, we know this. Oh my God, that was only partially true. Because it's often partially true what you know. So that's another reason why you hold on to it. It's not the big picture. So that, Newton does work, right? Just, you can't go to the moon with Newton, right? You just can't, but you can get to from here to Russia pretty much, unless you take a plane, and then it's a little dodgy, but not quite, So the thing is, we have things that work okay, but they may not be right. And also our identity is caught up in our believing in the world that was handed to us. I mean, that's how we're, that's neuroscience, like you said, I grew up on it. I believe it. So shifting that, saying, plate tectonics, people like resisted that and said it was bullshit. And then it turned out, oh my God, it's true. But before that, they had all of this data and they ignored the data. And this is one thing that, people think data speaks for itself. It does not, right? It does not. So you have the data, you have to interpret it. It's back to like the world is upside down in your brain. So you have to be able to approach the data and see or feel or understand something that is not already there, right? Already blocking you from experiencing that data.
One thing I like to say is any field that you really delve into, the deeper you go into the field, the more you realize that you don't know anything. Right. So like as an engineer, I've, gotten very good at certain things, and people will say, well, how do we know we can make that work? It's like, well, I know if I go through enough iterations, I can make it work. And they'll ask, well, why does it work that way? And like, well, I think maybe this, and this, but I could be completely wrong. And I've been disproven on several occasions, but I know I can make it work. I just don't know why.
Well, so another thing about it is you're getting deeper into not understanding, but also the deeper you get into nearly any profession, especially something like engineering, the more you realize that you need to be a salesperson, right? Because that data doesn't speak to it for itself thing. A lot of engineers, I perhaps have been one of them a time or two, think that like the more graphs, the more plots, the more data you can throw at a problem, you can prove to everyone why they are wrong or why this thing is the best or great. And you need that, as Andrea was saying, that heartfelt tie-in. You need that tie to tell someone why it matters to them, like why it's important to them. That's where it gets around to writing again.
Selling an idea is, I would say, one of the biggest challenges. So, I've come up with a lot of inventions myself, but like trying to get people to actually adopt them is
believe in them
really challenging. And same thing, like you could write a book, but how do you get people to read your book? How do you get readers to really pick it up? And you could write the best book in the world and be the best author in the world, but you got to also sell it. So.
Yeah, well, as someone who was shopping a pandemic book in January of 2020, sometimes you just have to give the audience what they want, and what they want is not what you have.
Right. I mean, because context is meaning, not just, there's no raw, it's always within a frame. And I think that's really, really hard, because we think there is absolute truth out there, absolute possibilities. And in fact, that's we have all of these illusions that are actually not operating as we do things. But we think they're operating. And people, for instance, numbers don't work. 10 million people died. Oh, I'll give you a story of one of them and you will feel something. But if I say 10 million people died, right, we all right now didn't have a reaction. But if I told you the story of one of the 10 million people and you could feel it, suddenly 10 million would mean something. We have a hard time with things.
That is literally my job. I'm a videographer, and like people hire me to tell the individual stories, to draw emotion on people,
yes,
to get money or buy a product. But you have to you have to pull their heartstrings to get them to make
right. How can I hook you literally into my idea, even if it's just like a presentation for, I got this great invention, it will do all these things, and people are sitting there like, yeah, we'll prove it. Well, I can't quite prove it yet, but when I don't know, and it's not even because they actually have an argument against what you're doing. I mean, they couldn't necessarily say, well, that won't work because blah, 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 because they don't know, but they're not moved yet to go with you on your extrapolation. So that's our work.
And, storytelling is...
You can finish saying that. You can finish saying that first.
I was going to say storytelling is a useful skill, whether you are, raising money for a grant or trying to convince people to do X, Y, Z. The older I've gotten, the more I'm convinced that conveying facts and figures is relatively easy, but evoking the emotion you want to evoke in your audience is the great challenge of art. Because especially with writing, language is subjective, and the responses that people have to words and sentences is individual to their own context and experiences. And thus, to successfully evoke the emotion you want to evoke in your audience is the hardest thing to do. And if you succeed at it, give yourself a pat on the back, because I think it's tricky.
Yeah.
This is a launch pad.
I'm glad you called attention to that, because I was gonna mention that question. I think that's a good one.
Yeah, I did too. I saw it. I think this will probably be our last question before we do some closing remarks. Do y'all have any thoughts about this? So what's the point that you stop trying to prove something and make the reader suspend disbelief?
I think for science fiction, there's a little bit of, if you're reading science fiction, you're open to suspending a little disbelief. But it all goes back to that consistency, right? If it's not used consistently in the universe, if it comes up and it kind of ends up being like a, what do they call it? Chekhov's hammer.
A gun that you brought on.
Chekhov's gun. Yeah, you pull it out at the last second. It gets the character. Like you do things like that and break that consistency, and you don't weave it into the universe appropriately. It's gonna break. And I think also as an author, when I'm looking up and doing background research on technology, I have to really be convinced that it could work, at least on a theoretical basis, or else I shouldn't put it in my book. So if I can't convince myself that it could be a real thing in science fiction future, I just shouldn't include it. So I think some of it comes from there. There's still going to be people that go, well, that's ridiculous. And that's okay. But I am writing for people that enjoy science fiction, not people that enjoy real science, right? And that alone, right? So I like the hard science, but there's always going to be some fictional aspect of it, and I think that's okay.
Even if you do your research and there is a plausible explanation for how the science how the technology functions, as an author, you're not required to provide that explanation to the reader.
Right.
You may choose to do so, and if you do so, I think a single explanation is sufficient. You're not on the docket in a court having to justify your actions over and over again. If you make a single effort to explain your technology, whether or not the reader buys it is up to the reader, of course, but you're not really required to do anything more than that. And a lot of times that's not even required. I mean, if you go back and read Dune being a great example, really the only thing that's sort of explained is the spice and how that allows for space travel. But pretty much all the other technology that's mentioned is just mentioned as existing, and he's not going into, Herbert wasn't going into deep reasons for why it functions the way it functions. So I don't think you need to justify your suspension of disbelief. Just don't break the internal consistency. Once you tell people it works this way, then keep it working this way.
There's some really good examples too,
yeah,
like
I think it's the
Donaldson's
same
Gap
thing
Drive.
as writing good fiction. Like when you write good fiction, you really, Carl Sagan wrote Contact. He does not explain that technology, but he wrote good fiction. He was a poet. He really knew how to engage the reader. And, so when he said, we're going to do this, we went on the ride, not just because it was Carl Sagan, but because he wrote good fiction. So you have to do all of those things, because people said to me, well, how can you have a character who speaks German, is a physicist, and is Black? And they didn't want to believe the character. So it had nothing to do, they thought that was unreal, so I have to, yes, but I have to come to the world and say, this is my audience, people who will believe that I can do Black English, I speak German, and I was a physics math major, right? Yeah. And so they're talking to me as if I don't exist. So I think that, you have to write good fiction. I have to ground the character in their world and demonstrate who they are. And if you can't get there, as, some of you said, that's your problem. Like, yes. I've written a good story. If you can't get there, I've done my job to my audience.
Yeah. It also depends on the character, right? Because you ask an average person how their car works, and they don't know. They might have a loose idea. You ask me, I've been in medical devices for 20 years. You ask me how a pancreas works. I don't know. I don't deal with pancreases. And so I think that it very much is, what does the character need to know for their life? Even if you have a spaceship mechanic as your main character, they don't necessarily know how the gun works. They don't necessarily know how everything in their world works. We all suspend disbelief, day by day. It's just sort of like, yep, this plane is staying off the ground, and not everyone is doing the physics of how it is staying off the ground. They see it and they believe it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Any final thoughts before we go into the closing remarks?
I don't know if this is.
Oh, good.
Yeah, after you.
I was just going to say one good example of the what we were talking about is Stephen Donaldson writes the Gap Drive in his Gap cycle, and he writes about people doing some sort of scientific experiment on a space station, and the project they're working on just disappears from in front of them, and something shows up on the, I guess, radar of the space station, and it's very far away. And that's how he invented his Gap Drive. They didn't know what happened. They just knew how to recreate that situation, right? So the author didn't know how it happened, and the characters didn't know.
It's that most powerful of scientific phrases. Huh, that's weird.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't specific to writing necessarily. I just think as a life philosophy, it's useful to be interested in things. And you can go down that rabbit hole as deeply as you want. But in general, having a general idea of how your computer works, general idea of how your car works, general idea of how stuff works in general is very helpful in life. And personally, I only get this one life. I find the fact that existence exists pretty astounding. I think the world and the universe is astoundingly beautiful and interesting and tragic and wonderful. So I am constantly mainlining information as much as I can, not necessarily for the writing, just because I'm desperate to understand this reality that we are in, assuming this is reality and not a simulation, but that's a separate conversation.
My ADHD helps me with it a lot. So I just constantly am like, oh, what? That's interesting. Let me learn more about that.
But curiosity, like, oh my God, what is that over there? Right. Yeah. So, and then following that. So I actually just read a whole lot, and and then I've got like this wealth of possibility because I've been reading a whole lot, and suddenly I need something and I go, oh, remember that book? And then I run and find it, and then read it again.
Yeah.
So that one of the ways that I get ready for writing is just read everything that is calling me, that I'm curious about, and then ideas bubble up from that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Awesome. Well, hey, thank everyone for being like willing to come on this panel. This has been awesome. Like, I feel stupid now because y'all are all so smart, but I am very thankful to have been a part, and I appreciate y'all being here. I would love for us to take a couple minutes here at the end and let y'all share a little bit about projects that you're currently working on, or anything that you want the people watching to know about you, or how they can get in touch with you after this, just keep up with you after this. So why don't we just start with Darran, and we'll work our way across and down. So.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so a big recurring theme in a lot of my works is, the engineering approach, using a scientific approach to problem solving and difficulties. So my main character is an engineer, if that's kind of what you think would be interesting. Maybe it's a book for you. So, instead of blasting and hacking and slashing his way out of things, he is trying to MacGyver solutions, right? Sometimes on the spot where he's stuck in a problem, sometimes, a longer project that he has more free time to work on. So I have 2 books out, The Engineer and The Dark Art of Redemption, that get kind of more extreme in the craziness that goes on as they go on. Neil can probably attest to that. So those are the 2 books I have out. I am working on now. I showed you I have big books. I see a lot of people's attention really is shifting away from big books. So what I decided to do is write a lot of short stories. So I'm planning on having 2 short story collections out in the next year or so. One of them is going to be just delving into more things around that world and exploring it more, exploring the characters that I've developed. And another one is actually a set of mysteries that harkens more towards like a Sherlock Holmes style story in that universe, and follows Actaeon as an engineer with a character named Aethelgard, who's a night investigator, and they kind of work together on technical mysteries. So the investigator just pulls him when he needs help because there's some weird artifact involved. So that's been fun. So look forward to sharing that with you guys soon, and thank you for having me on this, and nice to meet everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Darran. Christopher.
Well, I'm currently working on a couple of top secret screenwriting projects that I can't talk about. I recently posted, I got my WGA, that's the Writer Guild of America for screenwriters. I got my membership card recently. I used to have one, but I got it again, which is fun. Sort of more public stuff, I've got a bunch more Fractalverse and World of Aragon projects on the horizon. And it's just a question of time and energy and writing. But people can find me at my website, paolini.net, or on the sci-fi side of things at fractalverse.net. And of course, I'm on all the social media platforms. I'm most active on X, just because it's easy to interact with people, and I enjoy that. But you can find me pretty much everywhere, and there's always updates about what's happening with this special edition or this new book or this project.
Awesome, thank you, Andrea. Dang it! I keep doing that. Saying the name
It's
wrong.
Okay. Andrea is how they say it in German. So great.
Okay.
I am. My most recent novel, Archangels of Fun, came out last May, and it's about bots and circus bots, and an engineer, coder, mathematician, who's also a theater person. So, and there are a bunch of dogs, and I come from the point of view of the dogs, the robots, and the people. That's already out. I have a novel that came out in 2006 on a small press, and Tor is reissuing that in August.
Oh, cool.
It's called Mindscape, and it's a, like 100 years in the future, hard sci-fi novel dealing with a whole range of questions, issues, and technology, and also hopefully a lot of fun. I'm copy editing it right now. So I'm amazed at how much it has to do with right now. And in it, I started the book in 95. So we hadn't yet gotten iPad. No, we had pads, but we didn't have the iPhone until like 2006. So I had that kind of device in the book. So it's funny. So now it just seems like, oh, well, this is what people have. But when I wrote it, it was like, is that really going to be the future? So that's a really interesting, fun ride.
Cool.
And then it's called Mindscape. And then I'm working on The Redemption Center is closed on Sundays. And it's a murder mystery. There's, a range of people who are trying to figure out who is doing the murder. And one of the major figures in the book is a dog who has special abilities, and seemingly it's an alien dog. So it's somehow from another dimension world, and it has capacities that it understands and uses, but cannot communicate to the people around it how it does what it does, and the dog knows who the murderer is. So the book is about how to do cross-species communication. And I love dogs. So I don't own one, but I've done so much research on it that I decided, okay, I'm going to write this one. So the Redemption Center is closed on Sundays. So it should be out, I think it should be out next year in 2026 sometime.
Love it.
Thanks.
Constance.
All right. I write the Uncharted Hearts series. So the first book in that series is Calamity. I say it, quick logline, Calamity Jane in space. So it is hijinks with a planet scouting crew. So the crew scouts planets for eventual use for resources. Each book is told from the perspective of a different crew member. So the first one is the captain, whose name is Temperance, or Temper for short. And the second one is told from the perspective of a bounty hunter and the ship's medic. And the third one, which is just coming out in March of 2025, is told from the perspective of the ship's engineer. So we get to the engineer last. And so that's the Uncharted Hearts series. And you can find me on ConstanceFay.com. Socials are in a bit of flux right around now, but I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky and Threads.
Love it. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everyone. This again has been awesome. It's got me thinking. It makes me want to write something now,
Yay!
But
Do it.
Do it. Go for it.
I'll be thinking about it. I'll be thinking about it. That's for sure. So, but thank y'all so much. We'll go ahead and call this panel over. So thanks everybody for watching, and we appreciate you all being here.
Thanks for the great questions.
Thank you.
Yep. Thank you.